Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about health and illness in the white non-Hispanic American population. And again, to me that was a mouthful. It made me question a whole lot of things when I said it. First thing I wanted to ask was, should I capitalize the word white? Over time, I've stopped capitalizing the word white, and it's just kind of this own thing. I don't talk about my own personal life very much as a professor. I try to avoid it and just always talk about research and whatever I read in a book and some quote here and there. But again, what color skin do I have and what am I supposed to identify with is an overarching question. And so my whole life, over time, I never really was socialized that I was white. But when I had to go check the box for the first time, I guess was the first time I ever, checked the box and I had to ask, I guess, which race am I and what is my first question I remember being young was asking, well, why are there two words, white and Caucasian? What does Caucasian mean? I was like 7 or 8, just, questioning that. So maybe I started out young questioning race. I don't know. Maybe it's in my genetics to question it. But my own personal journey about learning about race, I didn't know anything about race until I was in a Latin American history class, finishing up my history minor, and I read the word mestizo. And, I talk about this a lot. When I read that word mestizo, Native American mixed with European, it just made me question everything. And then I went deeper and I started reading about other races I'd never heard about. And I was like, well, why have I never heard about all these races? Because in America, the only race that really matters, when from a close social class perspective, was white or non-white. Because one meant dominant group and one meant minority group. So again, the origin of white comes from money, social class. It comes from a capitalist trying to dominate a society. And those capitalists just happen to be European who had light colored skin. So they all of a sudden one day were like, we're going to create racial categories so we have a clearly defined lower class. And so that's what they did. They created racial categories and they called themselves white because of their light colored skin, even though no one's white. I mean, I'm not white. I have color. I mean, so when I hear things like people of color, this is something that, as somebody, I have to question that statement. I know it's become like all of a sudden over the last 2 or 3 years the politically correct thing, but every time I hear that, I kind of get a little upset because I'm like, but I have color. What are you trying to say? Doesn't everyone have color? And so I have to ask questions about the words that people use. I mean, because when you read Du Bois uses words that you couldn't use in modern times. When you talk about this idea of African American, well, where did that come from? That didn't exist back in the day. Well, why is that the word we use today? Does an Indian person really want to be called Asian? Does a Mexican actually want to be called Hispanic? Or is that just offensive to a Mexican to call a Mexican Hispanic? And, casually people use these words like white and Hispanic, people of color. They don't ask questions. They're just hearing this. This is like the the fad of the day. But the idea is you need to be questioning everything you hear. Okay? Because if you don't question it, then racism is going to continue, and Europeans are going to continue to dominate the society. That's it. And if you, same thing with sexism. If you don't question traditional gender roles, which are the number one impediment to women's rights, the idea that a woman should stay home and cook and clean is the number one impediment to women's rights. So again, if you don't question it, I'm not saying what's right or what's wrong. It's not a value statement. It's just as a scientist, when we go out and look at these kinds of things, there's a direct association between traditional ideology and women getting paid less, for example. So we need to be questioning things. That's what we do as scientists, and that's what we do in sociology. And when we look at words like white and Hispanic in the same sentence, and then you read a word like white non-Hispanic, what does that even mean? What does that mean? White non-Hispanic. Does that mean white not Spain? So anywhere from Europe is fine except Spain? Is that what that means? Or does Hispanic mean Latin America, even though it looks like Spain is probably in that sentence somewhere? So again, we need to be constantly questioning things, guys. And that's how it happened with me. I read the word mestizo and I'm like, I'm no longer white. I'm a mestizo. I'm Native American mixed with European. If anything, I'm sure there's some other stuff. And then what are Europeans? Well, they're all completely mixed. How many times did people from Africa conquer that country? How many times did the Persians come up from the Middle East and conquer that country? I mean, Genghis Khan came all the way over from China and Asia and conquered that country. The Vikings were going everywhere. Then the Celts came down and they conquered, they were all blending. Europe is a blend of Africans, Russians, Asians, and people from the Middle East. So aren't Europeans all mixed? Isn't the whole globe completely mixed? Am I actually white? And what is this thing called white privilege? And do I have privilege because I'm white? So from a sociological perspective, we're going to say that race is socially constructed so that we had clearly cut social classes. That was the whole purpose of race. There's no biological basis for our racial categories. Yes, people share common genes, but not all black people share common genes, and not all white people share common genes. White is an ethnicity, guys. White, according to the Supreme Court, again, is an ethnicity. It is not a race. It is an ethnicity. Our government of the United States is very clear about this. All right? And again, I shouldn't have to say this, but Aryans are from Persia, from Iran, okay? So white people are not Aryans, or maybe they are because people from Iran are white, but again, if you hear words like Aryan, that means someone from Iran. So, Hitler did not have the internet. Neo-Nazis apparently are not reading books. But guys, the point is, prejudice and discrimination exist out there to suppress people into the lower classes. So, racial, ethnic, religious, prejudice, discrimination, sexism, heterosexism, prejudice against sexual orientations, all of this exists, probably for one purpose, and that's just money. It's what it's all about. So that's where race came from. It's all about money. It's all about Europeans dominating society. So they ended up putting themselves in the upper class social positions, okay? And they've maintained that power for generations by subjugating women and by subjugating minorities. Very few people could actually compete. And then by subjugating poor people and making them a minority too, then almost nobody could compete with, the dominant white males for hundreds of years. Again, this is how they took over society. So do I have privilege? Not all whites have privilege, but all white people have access to privilege. That's how you say it. Okay? Because there are a lot of poor white people, trust me, way more poor whites than the other races. But, that's because they had a majority population historically. But they could have privilege if they get the education, to get the job, to get that wealth, to get that power. Okay, so again, what does white mean? You need to be questioning it. What does Hispanic mean? How old is the word Hispanic? It's a 50-year-old word, guys. It's just like, it's a brand new word. It just came into existence. There was no such thing as white and black like 300 years ago. Those did not exist either. We didn't have these words. Just like Democrats and Republicans did not exist in America. It was Whigs and Federalists. And we think about our political parties as permanent institutions, but guys, we just made them up a couple hundred years ago. Same thing with race. Like, we just made this up, and we're the ones who came up with the categories and the criteria. So, yeah, we need to be questioning race. You need to be questioning, am I a white person? Hence, I'm not trying to make it personal and bring in my own stuff, but if you guys can understand what led me to stop thinking of myself as white, it was books. And I'm not the first one to suggest it. My favorite one is Orlando Patterson, Harvard professor from that identifies his used to, not anymore, was socialized to think he was African American, but of course is now questioning his own race. And again, I'm not the first one to talk about this kind of stuff, guys. This is again all in books. So again, is white a race or an ethnicity? Race is biological traits, ethnicity is cultural. Race, there's no biological basis for it, therefore white is an ethnicity. And I like to throw this question in, when did the Irish become white? Because guys, the English consider the Irish an inferior race of people, So when did the Irish become white? Because we, as Irish experienced prejudice and discrimination, most groups did when they first came to America at some point in time. All right, so again, that's the social construction of race. That's the origin of race. If you want to end prejudice and discrimination against races, just stop calling yourself white or Asian or African American. Just get rid of those words, or at least change the meanings attached to race. You're going to have to change the meanings. Otherwise, prejudice and discrimination is going to be around for a long time. 62.1% of the United States identifies as white. Again, to understand how whites got power and privilege and became the dominant group, you have to understand the history of colonialism and immigration. Over time, the English then began to incorporate Germans and the French and the Polish and the Italians and the Russians all of a sudden became white. And anyone from Eastern Europe became white. And this was a long process. It wasn't like everyone was white originally. First, it was Europe and Spain, they got to be white, and the French and the Dutch. And then everyone else just kind of started migrating in. Again, it's an ethnicity, it's a grouping of people from every continent on the planet. So again, if you want to understand the idea of a white perspective of health and illness, again, we can look at the dominant majority culture, and that's again what we're all socialized into in general due to implicit bias. But the book breaks it down into a couple different countries, looking at Germany and Poland, and kind of comparing and contrasting health and illness. But again, you do see in the Western world more of a focus on technology, which is now developing over time, but that's definitely instituted in the medical system. Depending on the socioeconomic status of the country you live in, is associated with how developed the medical system itself is developed. So we need to be thinking about that. But the book talks about germ theory, stress-related illnesses, environmental changes, the evil eye. My wife, she's from Albania. The Turkish evil eye, very, very popular in their culture. Punishment from God, just reasons, causes for health and illness. Maintaining health and preventing illness, dressing for the season. Again, northern climates, maybe. Nutrition, wearing of shawls to protect, taking of cod liver oil, exercise, hard work, religious practices, sleeping with the windows open, keeping closet doors closed, cleanliness, all aspects of culture. And then the book has some pretty interesting lists of, the common cures: castor oil for constipation, for colds, olbas oil, congestion, goose fat, earaches, warm oil. The book's got some pretty good ones for that. But again, the dominant culture is what we're all exposed to in life. So you have to be asking, is the healthcare system white centered? And again, that's what really sticks out of me in this book, is that it really does pinpoint this idea that, I mean, since non-whites weren't allowed to participate, and since women weren't allowed to participate, is the healthcare system itself, you know, built on a racist bias and sexist bias. And I see this a lot when I'm talking about gender issues, especially because, like, when we're doing drug studies, do we sample more men than women? Are the drugs catered toward men? Are women being represented equally to men? You also see this with access. Who are the workers? Who historically was allowed to become a doctor, and who historically was allowed to become a nurse? Are there stigmas attached to a male becoming a nurse in modern times like there was in the past, and a female becoming a doctor in modern times like there was in the past? Okay, again, access to the education to get into the field itself. How is that associated with your race? How does privilege work? Do people discriminate based upon a name? Yes. Do you check the white box if you really need a job? Questions you need to be asking. Okay, how does white privilege work? And then also institutional discrimination. Okay, that's based upon this bias that people have. Prejudice and discrimination against non-whites, non-heterosexuals, and the list goes on. So in this class, we need to be very aware of how society is not fair, inequality exists. Europeans dominated societies for a very long time. They slowly have been losing power over time, but still, if you look at all the elite social positions, who's a politician, who's on the board of directors of this and that, how many, non-white football coaches are there? Then compare that to the players. Why is there a disparity between coaches and players when it comes to race? Questions and questions and questions you should be asking. But that's the goal. We're in sociology. We're questioning everything because that's the way it is. You have to. It's the only way to make things better and to make society more equitable. Thank you so much.